Live from SABC studios in Auckland Park, Johannesburg. Welcome to this midweek edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and on the show this evening,
the way are not actioners. People have given us the mandate. There's no way that they're going to give us an opportunity to go into a coalition with the ANC.
we ask, could the ANC be the unlikely beneficiary of action of an SA party that wants it out of power? And could ActionSA's ongoing consultation be the beginning of its own unraveling? Those are some of the questions we'll be examining tonight on the back of a Herman Mashaba interview that he did this afternoon with the SABC. We'll also look at International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, which takes place tomorrow, and we ask, how is South Africa doing on managing disasters? This, of course, coming on the back of that April disaster, which several reports pointed that wasn't properly or particularly well managed. All that coming up in tonight's episode of The Watchdog, which starts right now. ActionSA leader Herman Mashaba is blaming the Democratic Alliance for the possible collapse of all coalition governments in the Gauteng province. This follows the ousting of Joburg Council Speaker last month and the subsequent vote of no confidence in Mayor Dr. Mpho Phalatse last week in a council meeting which ActionSA did not attend.
We've been abused by the DA. Our people are really, honestly, really, they've had enough, and they've been saying to us, please, if it means we must be an opposition, be an opposition. But we decided as Senate to say, let's not really take a unilateral decision as the leadership. Let us consult. And then obviously out of those consultations, we will then decide. So, but one thing that I know is that our people are not going to allow us to talk to the ANC. Are they going to allow us to talk to the DA based on what has really happened? I think the focus has to be on 2024. So that's our ActionSA can emerge as the biggest political party in this country.
Herman Mashaba, the leader of ActionSA, speaking to our political editor Mzwandile Mbeje a little earlier. We'll be bringing you more sound bites from that interview, and to help us navigate our focus tonight, Professor Thea Venter, who is an analyst based at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Asanda Ngwasheng. Good evening to both of you. Thank you so much for your time. It was Herman Mashaba talks about a consultation process his party is involved in, asking its members what their attitude is towards working with a lot of them, but in particular the African National Congress. But then what gets interesting for me, Professor Venter, is that he then goes on to say, if on the back of this consultation, his party decides that they should work with the ANC in one way or the other, he will call it quits.
Yeah, it's a very interesting position that he takes in, and he tells us something about the culture of coalition. South Africa is entering, well, we have entered the area of coalition governments at all levels of government, and we are now looking at the same at the national level of government. And one of the things that is hampering the thinking about coalitions is to take certain positions too fundamentally. In other words, I will never talk to X, Y, or Z. We have heard the EFF do that. Herman Mashaba has done that. And that is not very conducive, because in the end, sometimes the situation that you haven't planned for emerge, and then you have to develop a strategy to get over that. But by hitting in your heels and say, I will never, well, that then brings you to the position where Mashaba is. Now we know that Mashaba is ActionSA. And I think this is just but a way of getting control again of some of the people talking to the ANC. We know that he has fired Dr. Khoza very, very early on in the discussions in Equatweni when she participated in one of the committees of local government. So that was his first action. I think he will have to mellow a little bit on this one.
Asanda, I mean, could it be that by taking the stance that he is taking and, of course, moving away from the Democratic Alliance, could it be that perhaps inadvertently he would actually do that which he thought he is or thinks he is not doing? In other words, by taking such a position, he is then allowing the ANC or giving these metros to the ANC.
I think that, a lot of these smaller parties are caught between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, that a lot of these parties were voted in because people don't want the ANC to continue to be in power. And so they're quite clear that a big part of their mandate is that voters don't want the ANC to be in power. That's why they were voted in. But on the other hand, you have the reality of coalition politics, which not only are, becoming increasingly important in municipalities, but in 2024, if we get a coalition government, we cannot have any political parties outright saying they won't speak to this party or that party, because we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And there's a lot of politicking and engagement that's going to have to take place in order for these coalitions to be formed. And so in some ways he's shooting himself in the foot, because eventually he's going to have to talk to the ANC. Will he have to, be in a coalition with the ANC? Not necessarily, but at the very least, he should be able to talk to the ANC, because that is the nature of politics. And the nature of politics, in any case, even without coalition politics, is that you do have to collaborate with, you do have to engage with, and you do have to, on some level, partner with an organization like the ANC, because even if it's not the main, political party in the country, it's still going to be quite a big political opposition contender across the country. And so it is too big a player to ignore. It is too big a player to actually kind of outright decline, and to even go as far as to stake his own political career to the mast and say that, even if his voters say that he should speak to the ANC, he won't, is highly problematic to me, because then it begs the question of, are you in power just to only kind of oppose the ANC, or are you in power to fulfill the mandate of the people who believe in you, including when they change their mind and they think that you should be engaging with the African National Congress?
In fact, I want us to take a listen to what Herman Mashaba had to say about what you both just said, stepping aside. And it's important in the context of what you're also saying, Prof, that Herman Mashaba is, ActionSA, and of course going back to how they treated their leader in KwaZulu-Natal, Ms. Makosi Khoza, when she started or accepted some kind of working relationship with the ANC. Take a listen to what he had to say to Mzwandile today around stepping aside in the event the party faithful decide that perhaps it may well be prudent to actually work with the ANC in some way or the other.
You said you are busy with consultations with a number of people. Should the overwhelming majority of the view say, well, we understand, we had this view before, but it does appear the ANC is the preferred choice, what will Herman Mashaba do?
Look, I'm not a prophet, Mr. Mbeja.
Yeah.
I can tell you something like that likely to happen. Honestly, it's in a minus. Actioners actually are happy. People have already, obviously, before we even started the process.
I hear you, but you have spoken about, otherwise, if then you know how they feel, what is the point of consultation?
The consultation is not about the DA, ANC.
Yeah.
No, please look at, go into our website to look at what this review is about.
Yeah.
It's about coalition, it's about going into opposition, it's about our focus on 2024. It's got absolutely nothing to focus on ANC.
Yeah.
ANC is just really, by the way, where we are asking people to tell us which political parties, in the event we need to form a coalition now, who do you like to work with? So ANC is just really by the way.
So even if your membership decides that is the ANC, you'll step aside. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And why? Because I've given a commitment to myself first. And I've given a commitment to people of South Africa that I cannot really associate with ANC.
Prof, I mean, that's okay. He may not be a prophet, but I've seen a lot of prophets wearing collars or shirts like similar to the one he was wearing. But on a more serious note, he seems to be taking a very, or shall I say, deeply personal a position on this, which some people would argue would be anti-democratic, as much as he may well be entitled to take such a position.
Yeah, it's interesting to listen to him. I've heard the same story from several leaders, and the one that came to mind immediately was nobody other than one of our elder statesmen, Mangosuthu Buthelezi. How often has Mangosuthu Buthelezi said in the years before, when things were looking different in the party than he wanted to have, that he will easily step aside. If he's the problem, he will go. And we knew nobody in the IFP would allow him to go because he was the IFP then. I think Herman Mashaba is very much in the same position. And it tells you something about the kind of leadership, and it tells you something about the approach or the hold that he has on ActionSA. And I think it is as much a message to his own leadership as a message to the electorate in South Africa. I'm here to stay. That's really what he's saying.
Well, it's a bit of navel-gazing, Asanda. I mean, if indeed things were to get to a point where he would then have to choose, between staying on as leader and, of course, champion a position he actually doesn't believe in. Do you see this party at this stage actually affording, that kind of, or even surviving that kind of a crisis?
I agree with the professor that this is actually not a real, I will step down. It's more of an affirmation of his power and a reminder that he is ActionSA, and that if he was to step down, that there would be very little that would keep the political party together, because in South Africa, we still deal in the cult of the personality when it comes to politics. If you look at EFF, what is EFF if not Julius Malema's party? What is UDM if not Bantu Holomisa's party? Same with the IFP. I've had conversations with IFP people who tell me, even though Buthelezi is not the leader as far as they're concerned, he's still the leader, even though officially he's not, because that's just how we engage with politics in South Africa. We kind of latch on to a personality and we run. That's why even Jacob Zuma in the ANC, even though he's even had a presidency, which is kind of ironic because that's what you want to ascend to, he's coming back saying he can be chairman and create two centers of power, because he understands South Africa to be a country that believes in the cult of the politician and the cult of the personality. And so I'm not surprised that, Herman Mashaba is putting himself front and center and is claiming that he will, remove himself if he's the problem. Of course, what's going to happen when it comes to the crunch is that he's just simply going to say it's been made clear to him that the people of South Africa need him, and that, you know, he's had a change of heart, and that he's consulted, and he thinks that he should still continue to be in the party, even though the party is going to collaborate with the ANC, because he's declared two things. One, that he'll never collaborate with the ANC, and he'll never collaborate with the DA. If you look at the numbers, it doesn't make sense. The ANC currently is, you know, even if it misses the 50% by a margin, it's still the largest political party. The DA is the second largest. And so in any scenario of politics in South Africa, you have to engage either the ANC or the DA or both. And if he's going to say he won't engage the DA, he won't engage the ANC, then it begs the question of who will he engage, and how will he ensure that, you know, he is in power, because that's what politics is about. Politics is about power and the fight for scarce resources, and you have to be in power to be able to do that. And so it's a very nice kind of conversation, and it's got us talking now, and we're not talking about the ANC, and we're not talking about the AFF and all the other political parties, and everybody's focused on Action SA for the next 2-3 days, which I think might be part of the strategy.
But is he, though, Asanda, to Action SA, pretty much what Julius is to the EFF, pretty much what Mangosuthu Buthelezi, take Prof's example, is to the IFP? Is Herman Mashaba that, right now?
I think he is. I mean, if you want to go a little bit back and look at Ahang and what happened to Ahang when Rampele stepped down, the party has never been able to recover. If you look at COPE and what happened when, you know, there were all these leadership battles, the party has really struggled, because people need a face. They need a face, they need a personality, they need an individual that they can attach to a party. And although it's slightly anti-democratic, if you think about it from a purely technocratic understanding of democracy, but people vote for people, just like people do business with people that they like. And if you can't provide that face, if you can't provide that kind of template of what leadership in this political party looks like, then you will struggle to gain ground. And this is why we're seeing a lot of political parties struggle to gain any ground, because they are not associated with specific individuals that people either feel, you know, an affinity to, or feel like, you know, they understand the person and where the person is coming from. And even in the DA, that was always the problem, that it got to a stage where the DA in Gauteng or the DA in Johannesburg was Herman Mashaba. And I think that's why Helen Zille and the backroom of the DA were very quick to eventually pull him down and remove him from that position of power, because he ran the risk of being bigger than actually the DA in Johannesburg. And in fact, I would say that's what he rode on in order to build Ahang, the popularity that he had when he was still in the DA, and it was all about him and Mashaba. It still is all about him.
Do you concur, Prof?
Yeah, I concur, not only with what she's saying, but she mentioned in the last part a very, very important issue. It's only the two big parties, the ANC and the DA, that has developed a level of depth of leadership. I'm hesitant to use the word collective, because that's a very ANC kind of term. But those two parties can sustain leadership change over time, and they have shown us to do that. The smaller parties just don't have that. And the one that I have studied for almost my whole academic life was the IFP, from its beginnings as Inkatha and through all its different iterations. And that is the clearest view of the smaller party. And I'm so glad she mentioned Bantu Olemisa and the leadership struggles in COPE, because that tells us the smaller parties are leadership orientated. The bigger parties have overcome that.
But I mean, would you say that's a function of, for lack of a better word, newness, Prof? In other words, this applies to parties like your Action SA, because they are still fairly new, and those who have been able to acquire that depth of leadership, who have had more people available and ready to lead those parties, have done so because they have been around for quite a bit?
Well, it's more than that. if you look at the ANC and you look at how political parties eroded away from the ANC over the last 50, 60 years, you'll see that it is a mix of two things. One is individual strength of a specific leader, and secondly, some minor policy differences, and then you get a breakaway. Same with the DA, the same with the other big political parties. Once that party has eroded away or moved away or split, I know the political parties use all different kinds of names for this, then the difficulty is for that specific leader to develop a set of policies that is significantly different from where he came from. And very often the electorate aren't looking at those policies, because one of the things that I've experienced in the 2 or 3 months before any general election, if we were ever to have an opinion poll of how many of the voters in South Africa has actually read the policies or the policy documents or the program of action, I think it must be very low. They're looking at the leaders and they're listening to the leaders. That's how we operate.
Well, with both the DA and the ANC being problematic at the moment, or at least as far as ActionSA is concerned, let's take a listen to what he had to say in that interview about their approach to coalitions.
If you got a call immediately after this interview from President Cyril Ramaphosa of the ANC saying, Mr. Mashaba, we are willing to work with you, would you consider that?
I will say, Mr. President, deal decisively with the Phala Phala. Take us as South Africans into confidence, because I cannot afford to be associated with characters with such serious ramifications for ActionSA and the country. And I will say to him, once you've dealt with that matter, then give me a call, then we can talk. But as long as we've got this Phala Phala matter hanging, I will not even accept the meeting.
That, for me, seems a bit inconsistent with what Mr. Mashaba has been saying all along. I mean, Phala Phala is yesterday's stuff, you know.
That's new.
I mean, he had been talking since he formed this party about why he wouldn't associate with a party of thieves, corrupt, and so on. And now it suddenly hinges, you know, on a conversation he would have with the president, if the president was to approach. Of course, it's all hypothetical. But it changes, in my view, if I listen to him correctly, you know, from what he has been saying all along. Asanda?
Well, the one consistency that you have in politics is that there are no permanent friends and there are no permanent enemies. And this is exactly what this conversation with Herman Mashaba shows. And I think, you know, just going back to the previous conversation, it's important to understand that South Africa is still run very much on ideology. And although, you know, the average South African may not be able to tell you the policy difference between political parties, the ideologies of the political parties are still the one that win the day. And I'm often asked, you know, by people, why do people still continue to vote for the ANC? And it's simple, because the ANC has some of the best policies in this country and continues to. So why do we have such a problem with the ANC? Because the ANC, while it has the best policies, also is the worst at implementing its own policies. And so a lot of people still continue to be with ANC because they understand that in terms of South Africa and dealing with inequality and a lot of what is wrong with South Africa, ANC policies are still the best way. And ANC ideology in its kind of original thinking, if you think from a policy perspective, is still the best. And so until and unless political parties that are smaller are able to show strong ideology and are able to clearly differentiate themselves from the ANC, we're going to be in this kind of tug of war of personalities, etc., etc. And it's going to continue to be personalities, because in the absence of an ideology and the absence of very clear policies, personality is the thing that wins the day. And so even if you think about ActionSA, when they started off, they were, you know, talking about immigration being top of mind and so many other issues. And now it's corruption. And if you come back in kind of 2 months' time, whatever the topic of the day will be their topic. And so it's kind of a fast moving train, which is what makes it difficult for people to understand why, our politics moves and shifts as quickly as it does and in the ways that it does. But if you understand that South Africans are all about ideology and therefore policy, even though it's not as kind of technical in the ways that we like to think of policy. That is where we are, and that is where we are going to continue to go. If you think about even the PAC still has some votes. People are still voting for it, even though we don't even know who's, the leader of the PAC, because ideology, people still have an affinity to that ideology. And so it's not always, I would say, as cut and dry as, not as cut and dry as only personality, but it is mainly personality. And the older parties have the luxury of still being able to ride on ideology. If we look at something like Azapo, it rode for the longest time on ideology and until it eventually died out. And I think COPE is very much dying out. By 2024, I don't think we're going to see COPE. And so this is the struggle of smaller political parties, how to continue to be relevant, how to continue to make news, which is what, Action SA is doing right now, making the news, staying on the agenda, staying top of mind for people.
Prof, do you think the question or the way the question was asked caught him off balance, or do you think he is leaving the door ajar and, in case, the party faithful decides otherwise, so he may have, it may be fairly easier for him to backtrack if the majority, of the party faithful feel that maybe we should look into talking to or working with the ANC?
I looked at his face when the question was asked, and I could see that one of the things that Herman Mashaba is good at, he has the gift of the gap. And rather than to answer the question fundamentally, whether he would serve in the cabinet or not, he took the Pala Pala route, which, like you said, is a recent development. And it may even be over in a month or so, and then he may take that call. But I think Asanda also said in politics, things may change to an extent that is unpredictable. And that is one of the things that politicians can do, and the Action SA will definitely do it. There comes a time when you serve in a cabinet. I mean, the Freedom Front Plus served in the cabinet of Jacob Zuma. If you look back at Dr. Peter Mulder serving as Deputy Minister of Agriculture, then you just can't even bring the two together. But that is exactly what politics do.
As to end this conversation, Prof, where does all this, being deserted, where does all of this put the DA? Now you're being deserted by your, I would argue, most trusted allies. Because if you look at Johannesburg, for example, Prof, even though Action SA didn't like how the DA treated them, they didn't get what they wanted from the conversations that they were having with the DA. They still voted with the DA at the end of the day. So they were among their most trusted. Of course, the decision they have taken now to move away from it is because they can clearly see that there seems to be no way of resuscitating the relationship. But where does that, put the Democratic Alliance in the metros? But where does that put the Democratic Alliance broadly, considering, only the other day, you and I were going to talk about Zwagele Mncwango, one of the last leaders, DA leaders, influential at that, of the party, was decided to leave on the back of several others who have done the same.
I think the DA has three very, very important problems. The one, of course, is a leadership problem, which they have to sort out. I am not sure that Mr. Steenhuisen is up to the task leading this, the second biggest party at the moment. The second problem is the role of Helen Zille. Is she making a kind of a comeback in some way or another. I know that she was elected in a certain position and she said she will keep in a track. I don't think it's easy for her to keep in any track. And the third problem the DA has, it will have to go back to the drawing board and do a little bit of introspection on exactly how they manage their role in coalitions. I know they're the biggest of the smaller parties, but they, in my view, play a role that is, I guess, a little bit too dominant for the smaller parties that has to work with them. And Action SA was the one party that showed that very.
Asanda, for you, I mean, what do these events mean for the DA?
I think that, the DA, I think Professor has basically laid it out very clearly, the biggest issues of the DA. But I think the one that I would add is that the DA suffers from a misunderstanding of South Africa and its history of inequality. And because of this, it completely misses the kind of policy framework that it needs. And because it's averse to conversations about racism, race, diversity, and anything related, it keeps missing the point. And instead of being a political party that was growing, which we saw with Mmusi Maimane, it's become now a political party that is shrinking, and it is likely to shrink further and further as it shows itself to be more interested in attracting white conservatives than the general South African population. And I think what we're likely to see in 2024 is not only the decline of the ANC, but also the decline of the Democratic Alliance. And if we get to 2024 before with the changes of the independent democratic candidates and everything, we might actually be in for a few surprises. And I think what's really interesting to see in this era is that South African political parties are actually learning how to be adept at coalition governance, at having these conversations that bring the voters with them so that the mandates that they need, they're able to get from the ground as soon as they need them so that they can move and shift and be more nimble than political parties have ever been in South Africa. Because for the longest time, political parties were able to stay on one point for 5 years and to kind of have the same politics and the same mandate. But what coalition politics does is that it shifts. It's a constantly shifting ground, and you constantly have to be finding yourself, and you almost have to do this dance between being so deeply rooted ideologically that you are unshakable while also being able to be nimble and shift to the left or to the right or to the center as required of your own ideology, depending on the politics of the day. And it is those political parties, particularly smaller parties, who will be able to do this dance, who will make it and who will succeed. But those who are unable to do that flexibility will really struggle.
Asanda Ngwasheng, Professor Thea Venter, thanks to both of you for your time and insight.
Thank you.
After the break, we focus on the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction Day, being commemorated. It's a day that gets commemorated annually on the 13th of October, and several activities are planned here in South Africa. But what we're going to examine is just how well prepared, how we manage disasters in this country. This, of course, on the back of that April disaster, which, according to several reports, wasn't particularly well managed. What does that mean for the country when disaster strikes? The International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction Day is commemorated annually on the 13th of October. Tomorrow, Traditional Affairs and Cooperative Governance Minister Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma will lead the country's events. For a discussion about this day and our experiences as a country, especially the April experience, we are joined by Dr. Wilfred Lunga, African Research Fellow in Developmental Capable and Ethical States Research Division of the Human Research Sciences Council. We're also joined by Siyabonga Hlatshwayo, Provincial Manager from the South African Red Cross Society. Good evening to both of you. Thank you very much for your time. Why is this day important, Dr. Lunga, or what is its significance? What are those who are behind this day and effort want us to do, to focus on, to think about?
Okay, thank you for having me. Yes, this day is very much important in that it's a day where we need to commemorate issues which are related to disaster risk reduction. And the main issue is about preventing new and reduce existing disaster risks. That is why it is very important. And the how part of it is that whatever is going to happen has to be inclusive in many facets. That is economic, structural, legal, social, health, educational, environmental, political, institutional, and that hazard exposures should be reduced among the vulnerable communities. Hence, it is very important.
Mm-hmm. And that's precisely why, Dr. Lunga, I mean, countries like ours have these people who are dedicated to, monitoring, disasters. And when they do strike, they should then be willing, agile, able to actually mitigate the impact of these disasters. That's why we have these disaster management units across the country, across municipalities.
Yes, indeed. There are quite a number of role players who are involved. It's not only the National Disaster Management Centers, which are scattered all over the country in the provinces, but you'll find also there are also other institutions like civil society organizations, research institutions, universities. They are all also doing quite a lot to make sure that people are aware and they know what hazards they face within their communities. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Of course, Siyabonga, we are having this conversation on the back of what happened some months ago that affected, KwaZulu-Natal more specifically, but which also affected other provinces like your Eastern Cape and Mpumalanga. I mean, those heavy rainfalls brought about, were quite deadly. More than 400 people died, and there are people who are still missing. Some families have never been able to trace some of their relatives. And by all accounts, whether one looks at the complaints that have been coming from the communities themselves, the reports that continue to be carried across the media, if one looks at the Auditor General report on how those floods were managed, it's not a particularly flattering picture of how we are able or capable of managing disasters.
Thank you. Greetings to you, gentlemen, as well as the viewers at home. Yes, the past floods that we experienced in KwaZulu-Natal were quite devastating. And if we're looking at these are the biggest disaster that we have experienced since 1987. Indeed, it is quite crucial that days like the International Day for the Disaster Risk Reduction are commemorated, because we get an opportunity to reflect on many disasters and also reflecting on certain frameworks that are guiding into how really are we ensuring that we are prepared, how are we minimizing risks. As you are looking at this year's theme is around the Sendai Framework Target Point G, which speaks to ensuring that there is access to early warning systems. As we would know that as the incidents were happening, we are fortunate in South Africa, because actually in the world, because there's those, in South Africa, the South African Weather Service that is always alerting on possible hazards that are coming. But the question is, are people really having, how much of access do people have to that information? Does it really reach the people that are in the informal settlements as well as in the communities? So to commemorate this, the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, it's vital that we reflect on these points, the access to warning systems, which does not only go alone, but it goes with measures to be put in place to ensure that even if the information has been shared with people, do we have suitable evacuation centers? Do we have relief items in place? Are we capacitated to respond to disasters? So it's quite vital that we reflect on such days and we commemorate such days.
Can I ask you to perhaps answer the very question you posed at the beginning, Mr. Hlatshwayo? Even though we may be always supposed to be adequately prepared, and we do have these early warning systems, do they reach the people, who are at risk when such disasters strike?
There's a slogan of disaster management about disasters being everyone's business. You're having national societies like the South African Red Cross Society, which are more like, in a way, a government establishment to support during times of disasters, that have a high volume of volunteers and staff that are spread all over the ground, which is a good network for spreading information into communities. But also the government structures, the municipalities being in place to ensure that the information is distributed. And also the biggest role players or the vital role players in disaster management are the communities themselves. So it calls for mobilization of communities before disasters happen, where we are preparing and ensuring that there is access to information. So it's an invite to everyone to play a role into ensuring that information does get to the people and we are prepared. And also even assets and infrastructures that have been that are in place to ensure that we are better prepared for disasters, that we all take care of, so that in future we are able to utilize them.
Dr. Lunga, when after auditing and looking at everything, the Auditor General reached a conclusion that the government's overall response to the flood disaster in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape was too slow. She also found that it failed to meet the needs of the affected communities at the time that they required it. Now, that is very unflattering for people who are supposed to be prepared, given the fact that, there are people who are remunerated, some of them very handsomely, to actually take care of this particular task on behalf of the entire nation.
That's a very difficult question for me to answer, but I will also give you my views. Yeah, those are some of the challenges which are experienced. But you have to understand that we still need a lot of capacity building among a lot of these professionals who are working to alleviate the challenges posed by disasters. I can cite an example which my colleague have just said, that when it comes to dissemination of information, we are found wanting. And the main reason, perhaps, is that we still have challenges in data collection, we still have challenges in reporting, we still have challenges in availability of consistent data, which we needed to use to make sure that we make informed decisions so that we are able to prevent disaster, so that we are able even to stop disaster risk creation. So when disasters happen, you will find, yes, we have people complaining that the responses are late. You'll find that government hasn't been putting enough resources, really, to those people who are supposed to be executing their duties. If we were to talk to them, we'll get a lot of challenges which they experience in terms of mobility. The other challenge also, which I can cite, is that even our communities, we are not really reaching out to them in an appropriate manner. The languages which we use are not appropriate. Hence, we have all these myriad type of challenges, and we are not addressing the problems per se. We are also not even engaging with those people who are always at risk. We tend to say we know it all. So the issues which you are raising then become quite clear.
No, Dr. Long, I mean, from what the Auditor General said, and which in part you have alluded to as well, is that, I mean, there are capacity issues that, I mean, she did flag, but also issues around planning and coordination. But what struck me was how she was saying that no lessons were learned from previous disasters. And in fact, after the fact, in other words, after disaster had struck, she also found, the responses were not adequate. In fact, there were problems that these communities were dealing with from previous disasters, which means these are problems that were known, that had been identified, but which were not attended to. You know, and remember, this is not something that is there. Like, I mean, disasters are not there 365 days a year. You know, it's something that happens once in a while. And can have, very serious, consequences. So it's about being prepared beforehand and knowing what to do when, presumably, you have learned from what happened previously and you build on that experience. I mean, from what the Auditor General was saying overall, very little, if any, of that had or was happening.
Yeah. Perhaps a question then can be raised. For me, I think lessons were learned, but were resources then channeled towards those lessons which were learned? And this is why we are saying we still have those challenges. And if we don't look at that and put more investment in making sure that everyone is equipped in the centers, then we will still have the same problem. We have to redirect and increase more investment in stopping disaster risk and risk creation.
Okay.
And the government is capable, actually, of doing that. We have seen what they were capable to do during COVID. So if they are serious, then we need to see a movement towards that.
Okay.
So that we make sure that the lessons learned inform the interventions which are going to happen now that we are commemorating and now that we know what has happened in the past.
Mr. Hlatshwayo, how much of a strain or pressure does the lack of preparedness, or when disaster would have already struck, the inability to do what is necessary, how much of a strain does that put on organizations like yours?
It's quite strenuous, and as it is from the disaster that we were responding to, we ourselves are still trying to recover from the support that we have provided to many communities, and there are still needs out in the communities. But also, it calls for us to take lessons, as my colleague was just talking about taking lessons. And also looking into the future now, how do we ensure that we are better prepared? Because just to highlight something, what I've learned over the years of being involved in disaster management is that we've been supporting and assisting very same people in same communities. So what we are learning is that actually there are other issues that are behind the disasters that are actually exacerbating vulnerability to disasters. You're looking at the issues of urbanization, of which the most people that are vulnerable to these disasters are people who mostly are living in informal settlements, of which these are areas that are in risky, that are risky and exposed to many disasters. So you're looking at, somehow we need to look into how do we minimize and how do we invest into communities to ensure that they are resilient to disasters. You're looking at, when maybe addressing issues of urbanization, how do we invest into local communities so that people are not really moving to cities for better opportunities. And also minimizing and investing into projects that are actually minimizing climate change as well as global warming. You're looking at, even there's a call by the president to plant 1 million of trees, of which we are supporting those projects, and also projects in the communities that are actually stopping people from moving to cities for better opportunities, because it's
yeah. Mr. Tlhatshwayo, let me thank you very much for your time this evening. Dr. Wilfred Lunga, thank you so much for agreeing to come and talk about these issues with us. We'll hear what the Minister of COGTA says tomorrow, because that will be the official sort of government's own appraisal of its own efforts. We'll hear what she says. But that's all we have time for tonight. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Good night.